Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Woody Wade, who is a recognized expert in scenario planning, who uses his unique method to help businesses and leaders chart the future. Woody, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to the problems you're trying to solve today.
Okay, sure. Well, I live in Switzerland. You didn't mention that, not that you have to, but I'm an American, as you can probably hear from my accent. I grew up in Indiana, went to Indiana University, majored in German, which I thought would get me absolutely nowhere. So I decided to get an MBA, and I got accepted into Harvard, which opened lots of doors. So when I did my MBA, and this is like back in the year, 4 AD,
right?
One of the things that they didn't actually teach at the time was scenario planning. They of course, it's that at the MBA level, it's all about strategy and sort of how to put together a winning model to to assure your future success in any kind of business. But there was no scenario thinking going on at that time. So when I graduated, I actually, because of this German major that I had as an undergraduate, I actually got a job offer from a Swiss company, came over here thinking I'd be here for a couple of years, and that was 1982. So you can sort of see that my personal strategy didn't really work out quite so well.
Right.
However, what happened was over time, in the couple of jobs that I had here, I got exposed to this concept of the future actually possibly going off in different directions. And I think what really cinched it for me, as far as a real enough of an interest to really kind of say I want to go down this path professionally, was for a while, for about 3 years, I was working with the World Economic Forum, which I think maybe you've heard of. It's they put on this big meeting every year in Davos in Switzerland, right. Where world leaders, but business, government, sometimes, there's a little smattering of celebrities and scientists and things like that. But basically, a lot of people get together and talk about sort of where the world is headed. And one of the things that struck me at that time was just how hungry these people were for any insights about how things might be developing, in the future. And of course, it's because they're responsible. A lot of these people, being CEOs or the equivalent in another organization, they felt the weight on their shoulders of having to put together a plan for making sure that they were competitive in the future, or their big idea would be implemented successfully, whatever it was. But everything was about the future, and that their entire jobs, at least as far as I could see, as a lowly sort of conference organizer, was to try to foresee what was coming down the line, and to get their organizations ready for it, or to be able to exploit whatever those changes might be, if they could actually sort of confidently see them. So with that, not too long after that, I actually decided to go independent and hung up a shingle and said, here, Woody Wade, scenario planner. And I was hoping at the time, of course, that I didn't have to have any kind of advanced degree in scenario planning itself. But what happened for me, as long as we're sticking on the subject of me, right. I wrote a book on this subject just a few months after I got started in the subject, and that book actually opened lots of doors. People kind of. My understanding is that the book is kind of one of maybe 5 reference works on the subject, and it's a lot different in terms of its look and feel compared to, let's say, more serious academic books on the subject. I won't say it's light, but it's kind of pays attention to design, and it's not like one of these very stuffy kind of books that has lots of footnotes and things like that. So it has become a bit of a calling card for me.
So what year was it that you did your first scenario?
10 years ago or 11, something like that. So right around the year 2010-ish, something like that. So it's not that long ago, really. I mean, it's not, cards on the table. It's not like I have done thousands and thousands of these things, because it's not the sort of thing that, your calendar is just chock-a-block with workshops. However, what's interesting is that the clients that I've worked for come from something like 35 different countries and lots of different industries. So I haven't seen it all by a long shot, but I have actually seen how this methodology can be applied to all kinds of different things, and that can range not only throughout the whole gamut of profit-making corporations, who are either, they're in oil and gas, or they're in fisheries, or they're in bicycle manufacturing, whatever it might be, but also in things like NGOs and charitable foundations. Because all of these organizations want to be successful in the future, right? And so understanding how their future might develop is very critical to the plans that they make today, in the hopes that they will not be wrong about how they made their organization sort of take the preparatory steps for a future that that will maybe materialize 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line, something like that. And now, of course, with COVID, the time horizon has changed entirely. It used to be the scenario planning time horizon used to be 10 years. That was kind of the the rule of thumb, and that you could play around with that a little bit, because some people said, no, it's too long. In 10 years from now, none of us will be here. We don't care. 5 years. I said, okay, fine. That's, no problem. I get that. But now it's like they want to see about, 12 months into the future, because things have changed so much. And you could kind of say you could have a decade worth of environmental changes, business environmental changes, compressed into 1 year, last year, 2020, the year none of us will ever forget.
Right.
And we're still not out of the woods, right? So the uncertainties evolve a little bit, and I can talk about that later, maybe in more detail. But basically, the idea that things can still evolve and the future might be in that direction, it might be in that direction, is just as valid today as it ever was. Only when that new landscape actually begins to solidify and be identifiable as a business landscape, that's now months whereas it used to be years. So it's changed quite a lot in that regard.
So I wanted to ask you about attention, and something that I noticed in some of the comments you made. You said that you majored in German for all the job opportunities, right? Then got an MBA, and
you're being facetious, I hope, because there are no job opportunities for a language major unless you want to teach it. But anyway, that's another story. Yes.
So then you went and got your MBA. There was very little in the way of strategic foresight or trying to parse the different ways the future could go. And then you said that all companies want to succeed in the future, which is self-evidently true. So why is it that this isn't more taught in business schools, and why is it that your calendar isn't filled with people wanting to do some forecasting?
No, I wish I could understand that myself. No, actually, the answer is that most business school curricula now do teach foresight. So it's one of those things that was, I did my MBA back in like 1982. So this is, I know I look very young, and but I'm pretty decrepit. And the thing is that back when I was doing my MBA, it was not on the radar of the people putting together, the MBA programs, basically anywhere. I think there were a couple of PhD programs already back then that specialized in that, but it wasn't part of what you learned as an MBA. Now I think that's different. I think most business school programs will have, they will at least nod to foresight. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have a course in it. I don't know, couldn't say for sure, but it is more well known. Now, as for the second part of your question, why aren't more people just clamoring, knocking on my pounding down the door? I'll tell you why. I'm not trying to say like they should be, but given the circumstances that we're in now, actually people really should be thinking along these lines. Why aren't they actually trying to do it in a methodical, systematic way, using scenario planning, for example? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the people running the show in these organizations are just on the wrong side of the age curve, so they are still kind of old school a little bit, back. I'm not saying they're not as old as I am, but I mean, they are perhaps not schooled in scenario thinking. It's not something they necessarily know about, or if they do know about it right now, or let's say the last 6 months, they've been kind of in panic mode. And, it's kind of hard. It's hard to convince somebody who hasn't already got a little exposure to the idea that scenario planning is a worthwhile exercise rather than a kind of a parlor game. It to a lot of people, it sort of smells like, won't that be fun? We'll just come up with 4 different futures, and then we have to go back and do our jobs tomorrow,
Right.
because things are collapsing all around us. And I'm thinking, no, well, if you do this right, obviously the exercise is meant to actually help you see how things might develop so you can actually make better decisions today, formulate strategy that makes sense and maybe is more flexible in case things go in one or another different direction. So the younger, I guess, short and sweet, the younger you are in charge of an organization now, the more likely you are to have had some scenario planning in your toolkit. But the older generation, and I don't know, I'm not sure what the cutoff there is, but, let's say anybody who's sort of been in business for 20 years or something like that, 25 years, is probably not well-versed in scenario thinking. Too bad.
So can you give us a kind of a sense as to how long the process takes and kind of the steps involved? And
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's possible to take as long as you want to do the process, obviously, and I would say there's kind of 2 different ways you could approach scenario planning. One is kind of let's say the Rolls-Royce version, very long, and you devote some real resources to it, time-wise especially. And there, I think you might be talking about a process that over a period of maybe 3 months, you and a team of people who have been kind of selected to be on, let's say, like a little task force, will get together. This is not a full, I don't mean, 40 hours a week for 3 months. I'm just talking about over a period and in between the times when you're actually, advancing through the process, you all go back and do your work and you cogitate on, what you've been doing together. So in about 2 or 3 months, you might end up there with a pretty solid set of future scenarios that has some real some meat that you can be confident in, and maybe even you've gone to what I would call the step of writing up little vignettes, which is kind of a fictional work, sort of a day in the life of the CEO in one scenario versus another, to kind of hammer home what that world might be like. Now that's the gold, the gold standard, the Rolls-Royce version. Now there's the other version, which is the let's say the platinum, or no, gold is. Yes. Platinum's better than gold, right? So let's say anyway, it's the Ferrari rather than the Rolls-Royce, let's say, and that's the workshop where you nowadays online you get through this process in a day. Back in the good old days when you actually could meet everybody face to face and go off into breakout rooms and have coffee breaks and things like that, I think most of the time that process was about a day and a half or 2 days. But in that amount of time, you can get through. You are not going to write up 4 fictional stories in that period of time. Clearly, that takes a little bit more time and imagination than you've got in a workshop. But to get through the process and to emerge with a pretty good idea as to what 4 different contrasting business landscapes could look and feel like for your organization, not just, in general, but really for you, as well as an understanding of what the opportunities and the challenges that they might present you, and then even some notions about how you ought to respond in each of those scenarios in terms of some kind of like a scenario, say, call it like a strategic to-do list or something like that. That can be done that can be done online now in a day. Let's put it that way. Maybe even a little bit less. I've done a couple of half-day events. They're a bit rushed, to be honest. I mean, you do get through it, but you're always wishing you had more time because you had to kind of, skip over some things or rush through something. If you're going to do this, bottom line is you really ought to be willing to devote enough time to make sure you're going to get really good results. Because otherwise, the last thing you want to do is go through this, especially because you're going to normally have some of your colleagues participating, right? This is not necessarily a one-on-one thing, but usually it's a workshop with maybe 15 people, something like that. And if you're going to have 15 people devoting a few hours to something, I mean, you want to make sure that you're going to get something positive out of it. So it's better to say, okay, we are going to put in an 8-hour day doing this, rather than to say, no, we have to stop after lunch because we all have work to do or something like that. And then everybody goes away and says, gosh, if only we'd had that extra half day, we would come up with something extra special.
Could we take a step back and walk through the process of scenario planning?
Of course.
Because
sure.
when you don't predict the future the way people think about it, you're not saying in 18 months the price of semiconductors will be X, Y, or Z. Like, you're trying to parse out different potential business landscapes. So tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the basic concept comes down to this: that for any organization, there's a very small number of what you call critical uncertainties that will basically determine how the future works out for you. And when I say works out, I mean, it might be a few months from now, it might take 10 years, but basically those particular futures will materialize because of the way that these critical uncertainties resolve themselves. Okay, so let's take a really simple example from the past so you can see what I'm talking about here. So let's go back to let's say you're a company in the UK, and it's 3-4 years ago, and they were talking about this thing called Brexit. We might leave the EU, right? And everybody, especially in the business world, if you said, well, will Brexit make a difference to you? They'd all say, are you kidding me? Yes, it's going to make all the difference in the world to how we do business, and whether we're allowed to do this, whether we're free to do that, we don't know. And then you'd say, great, so is it going to happen or is it not going to happen? And then people would sort of shrug and say, well, the polls right now are 51-49, and then the next day they're 48-52, and so it's up for grabs. Nobody knows. So that's a classic example of a critical uncertainty where the outcome is potentially hugely different if things go like this compared to if they go like that. But at the time, when you're actually looking at those two futures, you don't have any idea which one of them is going to actually materialize. So what would you do in that situation if you were a CEO? Well, you would probably say, we need a plan for both. We need to have two plans. I don't necessarily mean you need to have two 50-page strategic plans, but you need to have some kind of idea what you would do in either case, and have both of those things sort of sitting in the drawer waiting for the vote, right? And as soon as you knew which way it was going to be, you had your plan ready, and boom, you take it out the following morning and start implementing. Now, in scenario planning, the process aims to get at what those critical uncertainties are for your organization. And they're different for everybody. Now, in the case of Brexit was a critical uncertainty for, you could say, for thousands and thousands of British companies or companies doing business with the UK. So it actually was one of those rare situations where it was a critical uncertainty that wasn't specific only to you, but it honestly, truly was a critical uncertainty for you along with everybody else. But most of the time, the critical uncertainties have to do with things that are happening in your industry. They could be political changes that are sort of in the wind, potentially, right? Because you don't know. They could be technological things that are possibly out there, or maybe a new competitor might sort of come in. What happens if Amazon sort of enters your market, that sort of a thing. So the process finally getting back to your question, the process is that you begin by trying to list all or as many as possible of the trends and developments and even events that could have some kind of an impact on your future. And those are called driving forces, basically. And they can range from things that will have a big impact on your future to things that will have only a very marginal impact, but you still try to list them. And you're usually, to help you, it's basically just kind of an aid memoir to make this process happen a little bit more easily. You stick to something like the so-called PEST model, which, you probably know about that, but it's PEST is P-E-S-T, right. Political, economic, societal, and technological changes. And that just helps you kind of when you're going through the list in your mind, you're thinking, okay, I've done all the political changes I can come up with now. Let's move on to the next category. And you can basically then start listing in a systematic way. And of course, there are variations on the PEST model. Some people introduce another category, which is environmental change. So then now the PEST model is called STEEP, and then there's PESTLE, and then there's, I saw one time that had 10 different things, and it was just some unpronounceable mess. So nobody uses that model. But the point is that you have a structure that helps you to come up with these things, and that's what you do at a workshop, obviously, where you split up the team into 4 working groups, and set them loose for an hour, and they come back, and typically after 1 hour, 4 working teams will come back, and you start posting flip chart sheets up on the wall, and you've got 100 driving forces, and every single one of them, according to the working teams, will have some kind of an impact on how things develop for you in the future. Then what you need to do, the next step, is to filter that enormous number of driving forces down to the ones that really are make or break. Those are the critical uncertainties I was talking about before. So which out of those potentially 100 things are the equivalents of Brexit for you, right? And those things first of all, this is a very important part of the process because you want to get this right. But also it's important to go through this process because if you've got 15 or 20 people in the room, believe me, they never agree on what are the 2 most critical uncertainties. Everybody's got their own idea. So you have to have this process of kind of, basically just discussing it and coming up with some consensus. Otherwise, the whole thing kind of devolves into fisticuffs, and that's no fun. It's fun for me as a facilitator because I don't have to get involved. But basically, people do come with very biased ways of thinking about what's important. Then, when you have 2 critical uncertainties, just 2. Those 2 become the axes, the 2 axes of a 2x2 matrix. So you've got, let's say, across the x-axis, you've got Brexit, for example. So here you say will remain. The UK will remain. Here, UK will leave the EU. And then you have the y-axis, and on the y-axis, let's just say as an example, you'd have something like, there will be a U.S.-China trade war, and the other one is there will not be a trade war, something like that. And then the combination of how those 2 very important factors for your future, how they combine and maybe feed off of each other, determines 4 contrasting business landscapes. And then you go on from there, basically saying, okay, now if this really would be the landscape, what would it look like for us? Because you know, based on the process up to that point, you've got each one of them described by just 2 variables, right? Either yes, it's Brexit, and yes, there's a trade war or whatever. But there are more things than that will determine what your future will be like. So you'd say, now let's see here. If there is Brexit and there is a trade war, that would probably mean, A, B, C, D. And we could also imagine blah, 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 blah. And you just kind of go through it like that. It's all at that stage creativity, based on, feet on the ground, experience, and yes, of course, there's some hunches and some ideas, and sometimes people say, no, that's ridiculous, take that off the list. But basically, with people's know-how, of the business that they're in, the industry they serve, customer behaviors and all those other things, they're able to say, this is what those 4 different scenarios would look and feel like as terrains that we would have to do business in. And then finally, the final steps of the process are to say, okay, great. So if we're comfortable that those are indeed the characteristics of these 4 different worlds, what specific opportunities might arise for us, or what specific challenges would we have to tackle if we were in that? And then if we're comfortable with what we've listed there, so we kind of know what the scenario looks and feels like, here are some opportunities, here are some challenges, what's our plan? And then you put together your plan. Like I said, it doesn't have to be in great detail, because in some cases the plan is not something you'd even begin to implement for maybe 3 or 4 years until you kind of see which one of the scenarios is actually materializing. But the idea is that you already know in advance what you would probably do if that is the scenario that you find is the real working world that kind of emerges around you.
So can you give us an example of what a success story looks like, and something where you gave somebody advice and they took it, and then maybe an example of somebody that crashed and burned, and so I don't know, maybe you can't talk about that, but
Actually, I can't talk about either one, because in almost every case, this is confidential. This is part of the strategy formulation of a company. So, I'd love to say, yeah, here, let me tell you 3 success stories, but there's two reasons. That's one reason why I really can't do it. And the other one is because they're so long term, But let me tell you a historically valid story to answer your question. And maybe you already know this, because it's sort of it's the one that gets written up a lot. But it's the famous story of Shell Oil. Basically, back in I guess it would have been the late 1960s, Shell Oil decided that they would set up a little foresight team within their strategic planning unit, I suppose. And these were kind of, these kind of weird thinkers or whatever. They kind of off on their own at the end of the corridor or something. And, they were considered a little bit oddballs, because they were asked basically to kind of imagine the future rather than what at that time, seemed much more reasonable, which is to analyze, where are we going, and predict and project and forecast, and, the usual hard science type of approach. And at some point, right around the year 1970, one of the scenarios that they came up with for the future of the oil industry was that the countries producing oil in the Middle East, who were primarily Arabic countries, would eventually find a way to get together and use the oil as basically as a weapon against the West, mainly because possibly there'd be some flare up in the Arab-Israeli tension that's sort of simmering there forever. And that if that would happen, then it would be some kind of cartel or some kind of coordinated price hike or something like that. And it would hurt us all. It would hurt everybody in the industry, and it would hurt, basically everybody who drives a car and, needs oil for anything. So it was one of those things that went in the drawer, because, and I'm not even sure if they laughed at it or thought, oh, this is interesting or what, but basically they put it to one side because it wasn't happening. And bingo, in 1973, there was something called the Yom Kippur War, which is exactly the kind of spark that was predicted in this scenario. And within, I can't tell you how many hours or days or whatever, but basically right afterwards, OPEC was founded, and the price of oil was quadrupled overnight. And the Yom Kippur conflict was in October 73, if I'm not mistaken. And by Christmas of that year, so 2 months later, basically, 2 or 2.5 months later, you had a situation where in the United States, for example, they had lowered the speed limits on the highways to 55 miles an hour and gasoline prices were just, now we all wish that they'd go back to those levels, right? But but at that time they I don't know, tripled or quadrupled overnight, and this was outrageous. Well, Shell, coming back to Shell, when this happened, I guess the CEO of Shell kind of came, running down the corridor to the office of the weirdos and said, "Hey, do you still have that scenario that you came up with?" And there was not only a scenario, but there was a list of recommendations of what should be done by the company in case that would happen. And they implemented those. I wish I could tell you what they were, but I don't know them. But the legend is, the lore is that Shell had a huge head start on all the other companies who had never even thought about something like that. And so they actually were starting at zero, thinking about what should we do. Shell already had a plan. It doesn't mean that they followed necessarily every step that the weirdos had come up with, because after all, they're weirdos, right? But possibly they had come up with some things that were very valuable in terms of concrete steps that could be taken that would be, very reasonable for the organization and doable quickly, and would stanch the bleeding if there was some. And that's exactly what happened. So it's that's written up in all of the scenario planning books, because it's just such a great example of how scenario planning is meant to work. And in my own experience, let's put it this way, I've seen very interesting contrasting scenarios, and for a lot of them, it's just kind of still too early to say whether or not we actually have gone in this direction or that direction. Or things like I don't know, regulatory regimes. Will they get a little bit laxer or a little bit more burdensome? That sort of thing. And you can see, but you're touching on an interesting thing I should throw in here, and that goes back to the process, and that is to understand that when you've gone through this whole methodology, you've followed the technique all the way to the end, and you've said, okay, great, here's 4 scenarios, and they're different from each other, just like they're supposed to be, and here's our opportunities, and here's our challenges, and here's our plan. Yeah, great, woohoo! You're not finished. You're 90% finished. But the thing is that you have to then set up a kind of a monitoring program to actually look at the world and be able to say at some point, oh, you know what? It kind of looks like things are going in the direction of this one,
right?
In the upper right-hand quadrant, as opposed to this other one over here. And that monitoring program needs to identify what would be some logical signposts or indicators that you would expect could concretely tell you that, oh yeah, looks like this is happening rather than that. Because if you've picked your critical uncertainties correctly, they, at the time that you did the exercise, they are truly uncertain, right? So come back to Brexit as an example. If you did the exercise and you chose Brexit as one of your critical uncertainties, what would be an indicator which direction you're going in, right? Well, yes, if the poll started to show that it was 70-30 rather than 50-50, that would be an indicator, right? But if it remained 50-50 up until the last possible minute, the only indicator you get is the actual vote, right? Yeah, which is rare, because normally things sort of begin to be a little identifiable in advance. If we're talking about things like trends, a vote or, an election, something like that is something that clearly has a day where the day before you don't know, the day after you do know, boom. But normally things are evolving, and it's up to you to keep an eye on that evolutionary process that's going on, so you can read the signals that are being sent to you by the marketplace.
Yeah. So if you were going to go down the path of doing scenarios for I don't know, maybe this infringes on something you've already done, but a company that's manufacturing internal combustion engines right now, as an example, and we all know that there's all sense that there's lots of changes ahead for that type of company. How would you go about putting that together?
Okay, good question. Well, I would not necessarily do anything differently in terms of the process I already told you about. So I won't necessarily repeat that. But essentially, you'd say, okay, we need to figure out what are the driving forces that would affect us in the car business, the conventional car business. And of course, one of them that it's a no-brainer. It would just be, well, what will be the future of electric vehicles, right? So will EVs, they're coming for sure, but the uncertainty might be within whatever we've chosen as a time horizon. So let's just say it's 5 years. Okay, so it's not tomorrow, and it's not 15 years from now, but it's 5 years from now. So within the 5-year time frame, will EVs capture 35% market share of new vehicles sold, or on the other end of the axis, they will remain at less than 10%. I'm not sure what the number is right now, but so one of them is they're very successful and they're a real threat, and the other one is they're sort of still a little bit niche players. They're competitor for sure, but we still have 90% of the market. And then you'd have you do a second axis clearly, and I don't know what that might be, because that might be something a little bit more company specific, for example. And then that would determine 4 different worlds. One would be an EV dominated world, or an EV, maybe not dominated, but what's the word? EVs coming on strong, right? Another, along with whatever the other factor is. And the other one, on the other side of the matrix, it's EVs, nothing to worry about, still struggling, whatever it might be. And then you'd end up with your description of 4 different worlds here. And you might also decide to quantify a few of these assumptions. Like I did a moment ago, I said 35% versus 10%. Well, maybe it's 50% versus 20, or 1% versus 15. I'm not sure what makes sense, but the point is that you the customer, right? You the client will know how to define an EV threatening situation for us, and one where the EVs are really not a worry. And then what we might also do is, when we start to look at we start to sort of suss out some of the details of the scenarios, we might also assign certain quantified, certain KPIs. We might say, let me think of an example here. Okay. So let's say in a world where there's lots of EVs, so there's the 35% EVs world, we might say, by that time, there will be 20 manufacturers of electric vehicles operating in the world. I'm not sure what the number is right now. So I'm picking that number, thinking that that's a big number, right? And maybe it's 40. But the essential thing is that we would say, yeah, in that future, we could expect to see more makers of EVs, not just more EVs sold, but more companies behind it. And then we would also expect to see battery life, has extended and is now, 1 month, something like 1 month per charge, or the range of the average EV is 1,000 miles or something like that. So it's guesswork, right? It's always guesswork. But the point is that you're trying to actually not predict what it will become, but to explore how different it might be from the other possible ways things could turn out. So you're looking for contrast, and that might lead you to exaggerate some things. So maybe you don't really believe there would be 20 EV manufacturers that, but you still say, yeah, there would be, because this is the world in which EVs are really, they're the wave of the future. And, if that's the case, everybody's piling into the market, let's just say 20. And then if you actually, keep the outcome of the scenario exercise around for 5 years, and 5 years later somebody says, oh yeah, but there's only 14, so you were wrong. You say, well, yeah, what's the market share? Well, 34%. You say, yeah, was I really wrong? Was I wrong? Did it matter if it's 14 versus 20 or whatever? So bottom line is, you could quantify some of those things. You don't have to quantify any of them, because it's really all about look and feel. But sometimes the look and the feel, are become a little bit more recognizable if you put some numbers on them. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was really good. That was really good.
I was curious as to whether or not you have any way of getting people to accurately concretize their feelings about how they think the industry is going to unfold, because what counts as a lot can vary wildly between people. Even people who've carefully studied the field. So I'm just imagining when you ask this question, somebody says 8% market share for EVs, and somebody else says no, 70% market share for EVs. Right. And then, as you said, you want to stop it from devolving into fisticuffs. So, what does that resolution process look like?
Well, it varies in each situation. I mean, I let's put it this way: I don't have like a magic formula where I just step in and blow a whistle and say, now we're all going to play this one little game here, and then we'll emerge as friends or something like that. It's not like team building kind of stuff. It's more where you say, oh gosh, hey everybody, time out. We apparently don't have agreement on this issue, so let's talk it through. And it's never really been something that was not resolvable. But I'll tell you one thing that's relevant to this point, and that is you do have to be careful if the boss is in the room. And I'm sure you can imagine why, is because if you're younger and more junior, not as much experience, whatever, you are not going to say, I think it's going to be 70% if the boss says it's going to be 10. It's just, it's not going to happen. And I've seen the same thing happen, only a slight variation, whereas everybody's fine with all of the discussion. And then the CEO, who wasn't in part of the exercise, pops in at the coffee break to say, hello, how are you guys doing? And nobody says a word after that point. It's just like the room just goes absolutely stone cold silent, and I can't get anybody to talk. And it tells me a lot about the company, doesn't it? Sadly, but it also makes me think that it is difficult to reach true consensus if the boss won't allow consensus to be formed, right? And I can't tell you the number of times when the boss has kind of scotched the scenario development. And if I'm lucky, I can actually talk to him or her. It's never been a her in this situation, which also might say something about the style of a female CEO too, as well. But basically, if I'm lucky, I can pull that person aside and say, hey, listen, why don't you go back to your office and leave us alone and let us get on with this. And I'll come back and report to you on where we're headed. But I think that it's better for the sake of, open discussion if maybe you're not there just because you're a bit intimidating. And most CEOs actually love hearing that they're intimidating, right? I mean, this doesn't make them angry. They actually kind of go, "Oh, well, I guess I sort of am," And then, the next thing you know, you're back on track. But I did have a situation once. Let me just tell you one quick story. I had a situation once where we did the scenarios, and then the way that the day was structured was that we did them all, and then the CEO is going to join the group for the final hour and a half or whatever. And my job was I was going to be up on stage. It's a big group, bigger than usual, and I was actually going to present the 4 scenarios to the boss, and he was going to comment on them strategically. And on paper, that sounded so thrillingly and exciting. This is going to be great, And what happened was, he found me at the coffee break just before our session was going to begin and said, show me the scenarios. I said, I thought, oh, these are supposed to be a surprise, pal, you know? And then I realized, oh, wait a minute here. What am I thinking here? Of course, I better show them to him. And I did. And he looked at one and he said, we're not talking about this one. I said, let me see number 2. And you go, no, we're not going to talk about that one either. And I'm sitting there, I'm just thinking the whole day is just out the window. You know, what do you mean we're not going to talk about them? And I, kind of screwed up the courage to say, well, why? Can't we at least talk about them? He said, I was hired by the board of this company, 18 months ago or something like that, to come in and clean up and introduce a new strategy. And that's what I've done. And I goddamn well don't want any other vision than my own to be presented to these people. And I thought, I should probably just slink off right now and catch a plane back home, because I'm not going to end up looking good at the end of this event.
Did you do that?
Slink off? No.
So then how did it end?
Well, we just talked, how did it end? I didn't actually say to the audience that, hey, the boss decided that, we're not even going to talk about these two. I just said something like, in the interest of time, I've had a chat with so-and-so, and we really want to get into these other 2 scenarios here, because they're the ones that really are the most interesting from the point of view of kind of the existing strategy and looking forward. So let's just go straight to scenario number 3, and we'll start talking about that. And of course, nobody really notices. I'm the one, I'm the sweating bullets, but nobody else really. They noticed, but I don't think they really cared. And then you fill it the whole time, because of course CEOs they love to hear themselves talk. Like I do, and so there was no problem at all for this guy to talk for an hour and a half about the 2 scenarios rather than about the 4, and it turned out to be fine. But I didn't really like what appeared to be happening, to my event, right? I mean, He's the client, but it was my event. What are you doing?
Sure.
So it occurs to me that kind of the dynamics of something like this changes depending on the size of the organization. So is your preference never to have a CEO involved? And I'm thinking that if it's a smaller organization, you definitely want to have that person there involved
definitely
in the process. But how does your thinking evolved over time on that?
Well, my thinking basically has just I now just know to be careful about that, because it took me completely by surprise the first time it happened, and then the second time it happened, it also took me by surprise, and now by the third time, you should kind of be at least aware that it could happen. So in advance what the role of the CEO is going to be. He or she is either going to be in the process with everybody, or maybe come in later, or maybe just not, sorry, but this is not something it's not because I'm not interested, but it might be something that, I don't need to be participating, or I've got something else I need to be doing, or whatever, or I leave this up to the marketing department to do this thing or whatever. But even in that case, you still have a boss, right? So it's the hierarchical difference that causes the issues, if there is one. And I guess all I can say really is you just have to kind of be aware that there's always the possibility that there could be some ruffled feathers, because the troops are not, to mix a metaphor, the troops are not necessarily following they're not singing out of the same songbook, to mix the metaphor even more. but you see that, and you sort of are used to it. In general, though, I think you're absolutely right. It's better to have the person who is ultimately responsible for the future strategy. I would always want that if possible. And I also think I always suggest this, but it's rarely accepted as something that they actually take me up on. I also sometimes say, invite a couple of guests. Get a couple of outsiders who also know this industry or whatever to participate. And the answer is usually, oh, that's an interesting idea. Like who? And I'll say, well, you could maybe get, I don't know, maybe your biggest supplier. And they go, are you joking? They say, well, what about one of your big customers? are you out of your mind? And I said, well, yeah, well, what about a sociology professor in that case, who can talk about what's going on in societal change? And then they go, oh, well, that could be interesting. Do you know any sociology professors? And I think, actually, let me think about that. So the answer is that the process is, generally speaking, confidential. It's done for strategic reasons, right? And so they don't necessarily want to have somebody else out from outside participating, unless it's somebody who clearly, not only couldn't harm the process, but probably is, not even going to understand half of what goes on. So, what harm could this person do? And that, like I say, that turns out to be very, very rare. But I always suggest it because I think, one day someone will go, that's a great idea. And then we'll actually get, our biggest customer. And then everything will, I don't know. Actually, since this never happened, I don't know what will happen. What would be the outcome of that? But I can imagine it could be really interesting for everybody.
It'd be an interesting story to tell on your second appearance on this podcast. And if anybody has a hard time,
one from my hospital bed,
right? If anyone has a hard time disagreeing with the boss, I would just advise them to read your book, because in the opening pages you call Albert Einstein an idiot, and so if that's not an example of speaking truth to power, then I don't know what is.
Okay, well, yes, I guess I did have unkind things to say about old Al. Did I actually call him an idiot? I think I said it surprised me how stupid he was, or something like that. It's not exactly the same thing, right? Okay, close enough.
Well, so actually,
but can we at least, while we're on that subject, so that people who are listening are not thinking, "Oh, this guy's an idiot," we can at least. Can I clarify why I said that?
Well, yeah. So I was going to use that for my next question. So if you want,
go ahead. Yes, please do. No, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So he's got this quote where he's said to have quipped that he never thinks about the future because it's going to be here soon enough. And Thomas actually has this theory that part of what shapes civilization and drives it forward is visions of what our lives could be and what the future will what will come to pass, and
absolutely.
The ways we want to see it unfold. So what we're aiming for has a lot to has a lot of bearing on the present. And so I was just wondering, given your years in this industry and all the times you've walked people through this process, if you wanted to comment on that, this dynamic.
The interesting thing about scenario planning, and it's also one of the things that is hard to get beginners to take on board, is the idea that what you are really talking about is what is going to possibly, it's not predictions, right? But what possibly could happen out there in the world around you. It's not about you shaping the future. It's about the future that probably will end up shaping you. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on how big you are, right, in your industry, or, just how big you are, full stop, you could end up shaping the future. That's clear. That's obvious. But for most organizations, they have to deal with the world as it evolves, and they can, they might be able to have some influence around the edges, but the way the world evolves it's just going to evolve that way with or without them, and the scenario planning process helps them foresee that so they can get ready for it. Now, having said that, I do know I've read this. This is not something that's part of like my book on scenario planning. I don't think mentions this, but I've seen it many times. That a lot of people say, well, which of the scenarios here is our preferred scenario? So we've got 4 scenarios that we've sussed out here. So which one is our preferred scenario? And I'm thinking, well, as if you could actually, influence the Brexit decision, one way or the other, or as if you could, I don't know, you could actually change the future because you want one of them to materialize. Right. So I tend to say, no, don't try to talk or don't try to mix your wishful thinking, if I can, dismiss it like that, but don't try to confuse what you want to happen in the future with what you think really could happen plausibly, but rather if you get an idea as to what plausibly could happen, then take a look at yourself and your resources and your capabilities and say, hey, okay, so let's just say that this is the future we're handed. Now what do we do? What can we do to actually make that the rosiest possible future for us? What are the opportunities there that we can exploit? Maybe we have to acquire some capabilities that we don't have or something like that. But for sure you're going to have to make some changes. It's not like, well, we're ready for anything right now already. Normally, there would be some things that you would have to change between now and when that future materializes in order to actually thrive in that future, thrive the best you possibly can, right? But whatever future you're handed, that's got to be the future you work with. And so wishing up front that 10 years from now things will turn out in one particular constellation of characteristics only is practical if you can actually influence that coming to pass. And I think the chances of that are usually close to zero.
Interesting. So, there are CEOs that seem to have more ability to steer the future where they want it to go than others. So if Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs hired you to do scenario planning, would you amend your advice, or are those just sort of epical people that have some kind of flair that the rest of us can't aspire to? And so, what works for them won't work for us.
Well, that's a great question. So those two guys, just taking Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they've got each of them have two things that the average person doesn't have. One is some kind of a visionary way of just saying, this is I'm going to do this. This is the way things are going to happen, and I'm going to make it happen. But they also have, a bank account that we don't have either, right?
Yeah.
So you need to have some resources to be able to shape the future like that. If one of those guys actually were to come to me and say, hey, we want to do some scenario planning, I never thought about this before, but I'm almost betting that they would never do that, because why would they want some nobody from Switzerland to go through a kind of a pedestrian process that everybody goes through, when they know all they have to do is just say, you know what, going to Mars, and it just happens, and that wouldn't come out of the scenario process. I don't think it's worth thinking about, but it's a really interesting question.
I would point out that they didn't always have a lot of money. That they were.
I know.
That they were much more like us when they started. So
I know. Yeah, you're right. You're right. So, but it means in that case then that they had the indomitable, vision and spirit that said, I don't have the money now, but with this vision, the money will soon follow, and it did. I'm not saying that just because you have that particular personality that instantly riches just kind of pile up around you. If only that were true. But I would say that if you're one of those 1 in a million people, like those two guys, they know that they have established a track record of making things happen that weren't. It's not that I don't think anybody said this. That's impossible. They never even thought of it in the first place, right? So nobody had any idea that something was possible or impossible. There was nobody saying, "Oh no, Elon, come on, that's a stupid idea." Just hey, I'm going to do this, and off he went. And there just aren't many people like that. You could probably count them on both hands and both feet in the history of business. The Thomas Edisons and the Henry Fords, and I've already run out of names. I don't know. Bill Gates. There are some, of course. Steve Jobs. Yeah, we could come up with some. But those you can't. In a certain way, you can't really measure the value of scenario planning against what these guys are able to do just because they're human dynamos. And that's not, sadly, that's not what the world is made of in a normal organization. They're mortal beings like the three of us, and they need some structure to help them think about the future rather than to say, I've already got a bizarre idea, I'm going, off I go, bye. And nobody can stop them, and most of the time it works out.
So do you do work for militaries then too? Because I'm sure they go through lots of scenario planning.
Yes, I do. Yeah, they have. That's also, I think, one of the places where scenario planning originally started, even before the shell days, because you can imagine, an army would want to have some idea of the possible, conflict landscapes that are out there that they might be dealing with, in the very near future. What are the enemy's capabilities? Where is the enemy? Where could the enemy be next week? That sort of a thing. So it's clear that's where the mindset came from.
Okay.
Do I work with military? Not like that. No, I've done a couple of things with some organizations that are, in the military umbrella, but it's more to do with long-term security issues. For example, I did something. It was a room full of people who were all in the military, but from 25 different countries, and they were all security analysts for their respective countries. And we did something on the future of ISIS, and that was pretty interesting because some of the people in the room actually knew a lot about it, and other people, if you're the chief security officer for Panama or something like that, ISIS is not really on your radar screen the way other security issues might be, like migration or something like that. But if you are from Pakistan or something like that, yeah, it's you got a lot of know-how. And we came up with 4 different scenarios for how ISIS could develop over the next 5 years. That was about 5 years ago, and it was how it could develop over the following 5 years, something like that. But I don't think anybody actually, left the room and made a phone call and said, here are the coordinates, make sure those bombs are falling by 2 p.m. Nothing quite like that. If only. It's a great story to tell.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking about your methodology and regaling us with stories of your exploits. And we hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, this is terrific.
I hope so too. I've had a great time. Thank you very much for your interest, and I would look forward to another chance to talk anytime.
One more. How can people find you if they're not visionary genius billionaires and they're interested in scenario planning?
Even if you are a visionary billionaire, let me give you my website anyway, right? So it's woodywade.com, and Woody Wade is written as one word, Woody, like Woody, right? Sure. And Wade, like Wade in the water, WADE.com. And that's where you'll find out all the details about getting in touch.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it.